the audience here and at home, following online. It's a pleasure to welcome you all and our speaker for today in this installment of the LCAP series, Leuven, Colloquia and Ancient Platonism. And today's speaker is Professor van Riel, Gerd van Riel from Leuven. People who have seen the program earlier on may have noticed that we have had to change the program. So originally we had Professor Ingrid Meinler and Robert here today, but she couldn't make it, and we hope to have her next year. But Gerd van Riel was so kind as to immediately accept our invitation to take her place, and we thank him very much also for well, being willing to do this on such short notice. And of course, Gerd van Riel is also a very well-known, famous scholar of Platonism and of Plato. He quite recently, a couple of years ago, published the complete new edition of Proclus's commentary on the Timaeus in 5 books, Oxford University Press. But that's of course not the first thing he published. He also published in the French Boudet series, Damascius commentary on the Philebus. And Damascius is one of the topics he has worked on a lot. And today we will hear him talk about Damascius metaphysics. The title of his talk is Damascius's Open Metaphysics. And we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this. So please get join me.
So thank you, Jan. Thanks for the kind introduction and also for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to share some ideas, even if at short notice. In this case, it must mean, I'm afraid, that I need to introduce a disclaimer. This is what I'm going to deliver is a reversed version of a paper that I have already delivered during the epidemic at Heidelberg in a conference in memory of Jens Halfwassen. The text has since been published in a collective volume edited by Georg Paschaliau, who is not an unknown here in Leuven. All right, you have a handout. I will be following that in a very strict order, and I'll be referring to the texts in number of appearance. And the starting text may be very strange, as the first passage to be discussed is taken from a text that may seem very remote from metaphysical speculation in the first place. It is the 4th book of the Laws, and we have no texts in which Damascius or Proclus, for that matter, address this text directly. So what's the purpose of starting with this text if we are not going to talk about it anyways, right? But that's not entirely the case. You find the text in the handout number 1. It's the 4th book is actually the start of the founding of Magnesia, where in the narrative the colonists are welcomed into the city, and we immediately read an address to the newcomers. And the first word those newcomers get to hear is on God, right? What are the right standards? What is the right attitude towards God? And what is the key to genuine or sincere religiosity? Yeah? Even in the absence of a word for religion, you can see that that's what it is about. Therapia ton theon, so the way of, let's say, taking the gods at heart. The main point of the text is that God is the measure of everything, and that the point of being religious is to be measured by God, to allow yourself to be measured by God. Let me read the text. It's a famous text, actually contradicting Protagoras' Homo Mensura. The man who means to live in happiness latches onto her, divine law that is, and follows her with submission and sense of order. But he who bursts with arrogance, elated by wealth or honors, or by physical beauty when young and foolish, whose soul is afire with insolence, hubris, the term is going to be important, as if so far from needing someone to control and lead him, he can play the leader to others. There's a man whom God has deserted. So what conduct recommends itself to God and reflects his wishes? There's only one sort, epitomized in the old saying, like approves of like, excess apart, which is both its own enemy and that of due proportion. In our view, it is God who is preeminently the measure of all things, much more so than any man, as they say. So if you want to recommend yourself to someone of this character, you must do your level best to make your own character reflect his. And on this principle, the moderate man is God's friend, being like him, whereas the immoderate and unjust man is not like him and is his enemy. And the same reasoning applies to the other vices as well. So the reaction is against self-conceited people who, led by their hubris, translated here by Saunders as, what was it, insolence? Saunders very often just paraphrases the text, or in this case, I would say maybe transgression or, self-conceited despise of any measure, right? A failure to observe the boundaries set to human existence, right? So those self-conceited people against whom Plato is reacting here are taking themselves to be the measure of all. And his alternative, explicitly formulated, is or consists in moderation and a sense of order in which people let themselves be measured by God. And then Plato, a bit surprisingly, connects this with the old dictum, like knows like. A bit surprising, I say, because in this case, you can hardly say that if you're moderate, you are like God, right? It's a bit strange to do that. So the likeness he's talking about in this case is not a reciprocal or a symmetrical relationship. God is the measure, and we become like God by being measured by God, which is not an equal relation at all, right? In any case, what Plato expresses here, and maybe for the first time in very clear words in ancient philosophy, is that God is the measure of all, metron theon, right? Which I should add is totally different from what Plato expressed in the Theaetetus 176 AB about homoiosis theoi, where it's about becoming like God because we have to purify ourselves and to take the perspective of God. Quite the contrary here, what Plato stresses in this text is the unsurmountable distance between humans and God, right? Maybe rather reflecting the katatodynaton insofar as possible, which Plato added to the homoiosis theoi in the Theaetetus, saying you have to become like God insofar as that is humanly possible, right? Thereby stressing the fact that we are humans, that we remain humans, and we are not gods. So being like God is actually rather about being liked by God, right? Being liked by God is not the same as being like God, as I tended to say. Those who are moderate, the word is sophron, right? Sophrosune, opposed to hubris. Yeah? Those who are moderate know their place, and they refrain from trespassing the boundaries set by God and by nature. Okay, so the worst thing you could do as a human is presume that you are like God in a sense that you become the measure of all things. You should become like God by being measured by God. This idea, which Plato expresses in his old age, right? This idea reflects an age-old tradition, also expressed by Aeschylus and Sophocles, which you find in text number 2 and 3 on the handout. In Aeschylus, the suppliant women, in the text, a chorus warns against being overly demanding towards the gods. And they say, how can I be expected to see into the mind of Zeus, gazing into its bottomless depths. The Argive soldiers answered, then make your prayer a moderate one. What are you instructing me is the right choice, not to ask too much of the gods, right? So moderation is not to ask too much of the gods. And in Sophocles, Ajax, a freed slave, Teucer, is rebuked for being insolent in that translation of the word hubris. So he hybridze. Here you are rashly insulting us, maybe an under translation, letting your mouth run on and on. You should control yourself. Do you not realize who you are by birth? So control yourself, be moderate against this insolence, this hubris, consists in recognizing your place, how you were born, the person you are by birth, and you can't trespass this kind of boundary, right? Okay, 1,000 years later, let's stress that, right? We are 1,000 years past Plato. In Damascius, we have no text, no preserved text at least, with any direct reference to the passage from Laws 4, as I said. And even the term sophrosyne, or moderation, occurs actually rather scarcely. Right? In Vita Isidori, in the context of the eloge of the life of Isidorus, as you can expect, sophrosyne is meant to be, let's say, an identification of the virtuous life of someone like Isidorus. And then in his commentaries on Plato, on the Philebus and the Phaedo, sophrosyne consists in a resistance towards lower reality. The purification of your passions, of your emotions, pate, by which you master your lower desires, avoid or purify your pleasure and pain. In that sense, which is strictly Platonic, right? The Plato of the Phaedo would say this. In that sense, sophrosyne does not come down to avoidance of hubris in the first place, but rather on the purification, the catharsis, as Plato wants it to have in Phaedo, 69, about the cathartic virtues that purify us and turn us towards higher reality and away from lower senses. Never in Damascius we find a connection made between sophrosyne and metron theos, as we found it in Laws 4, nor is there any reference to eusebeia, theophiles, or philotheon. And the only direct hint we find at metron theos in Damascius is in Phaedonem 1:13, where it says metron theoten, without any further explanation. So we don't come very far if it is about finding direct references to this text. And yet, the idea of a metron that exceeds us is prominently present in relation to the good and the way in which Damascius, or the Neoplatonic tradition in general, expresses the position of the good. Damascius clearly connects the measure of the universe to the good, which is a metaphysical principle, right? It's not per se a god. And in doing so, Damascius uses Philebus as a hermeneutical tool. In text 4, we read in the Philebus, we have not yet read anything from Damascius himself, but we'll get there, right? But Philebus 65a argues that the good is unattainable in itself, but that it can be approached by three characteristics: truth, beauty, and proportion. Proportion being symmetria, but also taken up as metriotes a bit further in Philebus. Let me read the text. Well then, if we cannot capture the good in one form, we will have to take hold of it in a conjunction of three: beauty, proportion, and truth. Let us affirm that these should by right be treated as a unity and be held responsible for what is in the mixture, for its goodness is what makes the mixture itself a good one. A bit before this passage, I haven't taken it up in the handout, but just a couple of lines before 64c, that is, Plato says that beauty, proportion, and truth are the thresholds of the dwelling of the good. So you don't enter its house, you only stop at the threshold where you find those three together. And then follows this 65a passage where they are seen as a multiplication of the one character of the good, which is ungraspable, unfolded in three specific characteristics. As can be expected, Damascius will emphasize the suggestive character of those three forms, right? Endeixis, the suggestion, is one of his favorite categorizations of what we do when talking about the first principle. And in this case, he sees it as implied in the three forms, truth, proportion, and beauty, which he refers to as monads, right? Monads always being a reflection of unity, monos, in that sense, by participation in the good, whereas henas, in the standard Neoplatonic terminology, is always a reflection of unity by its participation in oneness. It comes down to the same, but the emphasis lies elsewhere. And so those three monads actually reveal or point at, suggest a nature that otherwise remains hidden. In his commentary on the Philebus, he says that there is a unique feature, it's not on the handout, I'm sorry, mia idea, one unique feature that allows us to grasp the good, its uniqueness epitomized in the name, the One. But as the nature of the One remains ineffable, we have to view it as a duality, one plus everything, right? And one and everything are then taken up to be, let's say, the frame of Philebus's Peras and Apeiron. In his De Principiis, his main work, Damascius will then go on and explain that those two, let's say, characterizations, one and everything, are in fact subsequent stages of the self-development of the One, of the first principle. First, hen panta, right? Everything, no, one everything. So some kind of compressed unity like a computer file, right? Where by the compression, everything remains there, but it's unreadable. And you have to unfold it gradually, step by step, in order to understand what it actually contains. And the first stage where this happens is not hen panta, but panta hen, right? A unity of all things, which become a bit more, let's say, perceptible in the sense of being a multiplied existence of the One, which becomes graspable to our minds. Right? So we unfold, or the multiplication of the universe unfolds itself in different stages. That's the later or the mature Damascius expressing his ideas, which in Philebum are not as clearly expressed as I present them now. But if we go back to the Philebus, you could say that even the accessway of different developmental stages of the One, hen panta, panta hen, might be ineffective in describing the nature of the one good. And in that case, the stand-in we end up with are those three monads, which are not the One itself, right? Plato expresses this very clearly, but they stand at its threshold, right? Indicating the first effects that the one good has on lower reality, in Neoplatonic interpretation, that is. So in that sense, they are the endeixis, the indication or the suggestion of the ineffable nature of the first principle. That's what you find expressed in De Principiis in the edition 3, 142, text 5 on the handout. And so also Socrates, I quote, in the Philebus, was unable to gaze in the face of that One and clarified its nature by means of the Triad stationed at its threshold, as he says, because he caught a glimpse of that triad quivering with the single ray of the Hennet in a completely unified vision. In sum, as with other things, so with the triad, we return to that realm through indication, kata endexin. The three monads are of a lower nature than the one, or they are of the nature of the mixed, as they would say, but they announce what is beyond them as knowable concepts, gnorismata, that refer us to a hidden reality. That's text 6. That Socrates does not intend this one, the one as a unifying character, but rather something of higher station and ineffable, he makes clear when he dismisses the one on the grounds that it is entirely hidden, whereas he introduces the three monads in the threshold of the one as knowable concepts of it, the three of the one. Now, when discussing the three monads on the threshold of the good, one good, Damascius makes an implicit reference to laws 4 by rephrasing Plato's symmetria as metron, text 7. The single principle of all, first, constitutes everything in its own characteristic, whence its light is truth. Second, it presents itself to all things as desirable, whence it is the first beauty and the cause of things beautiful. And third, it also defines all measures that impose themselves to all things that belong to the series that comes from it, whence it is praised as metron, as measure. So what the principle is in a unitary way, that is what the three monads are in a divided way. And thus they express the single principle. So the metron is read into a thoroughly metaphysical interpretation of the text, as was to be expected. From that perspective, Damascius also discusses the moral implications of this measuring presence of the good. He emphasizes the need to liberate ourselves from all kinds of multiple things, including the multiplicity of our dianoia, of our discursive thought, in order to attain a unity in nous, in intellect, and beyond that, but that's not noetic any longer. So God measures the universe, God in this case, the first principle, first and foremost by imposing measure onto intellect. And the moral implication is that we should adjust to this metaphysical order by purifying our souls in order to attain the higher realm and abstain from the sensible world. Until now, we have been focusing on a purely metaphysical interpretation of moderation. Yet, there is another type of moderation at play, which comes much closer to the attitude described by Plato in the Laws, meaning a moderation that takes God as the measure by accepting that we are humans and not God, right? That goes beyond just saying the first principle is the metron of the universe, okay? So we are humans, we are not God, and we humans need to observe our place in relation to God. So much closer to our opening text than what we have been encountering until now. And this is reflected in Damascius' use of a very specific cluster of terms, polypragmoneo, polypragmosune, and tolma, tolmao, as for instance in text number 8. If in saying these things about it, that it is ineffable, that it is the inner sanctuary of all things, and that it cannot be conceived, if we contradict ourselves in our argument, it is necessary to realize that these are names and thoughts that express our labor pains, odinas, which dare to busy themselves with it in multiple ways, standing at the threshold of the inner sanctuary, but reporting nothing about what it involves. Instead, they reveal our own states with regard to it, and the puzzles and the failure to find resolution, and that not clearly, but through intimations, and that only to those who are capable of attending to these things. So a couple of things go wrong in this conditional clause, right? If we do, actually what we do is we play with our odinas, our birth pains, our labor pains, or gestation, or travail, or what is the right term? Having the sense that something must come out, right? And it doesn't get out, right? Plus, we dare to busy ourselves. This daring is the tolma, right? If you see the Greek just above the second line, noemataton hemeteron odinon hosai polypragmonein ekeino tolmosin, right? It's the tolma that dares to busy ourselves with it. Now, it is well known that Plotinus used tolma to indicate the temerity of our soul, which led to the soul's fall and to the existence of evil, right? If you take, for instance, text 9, but there are more texts of Plotinus to be found. For the souls, the cause of evil is temerity, tolma, becoming the first otherness, and also the wish to be independent. So tolma is actually a very loaded term in this Neoplatonic tradition. And it's not a coincidence that Damascius takes up this reference to a fallen situation, which consists in a lack of perspective, in a lack of knowledge, needed to give an accurate description of the higher realms. So it refers to the fact that we are not at the same level as the gods, which is then felt in an irreparable lack of knowledge. Our intellectual abilities fall short, which is an epistemic gap, if you want, which, for instance, is present in the argument as elaborated in text number 10, taken from the De Principiis. Who then could adjudicate this amount of arguments that clash with each other about matters of such consequence? The gods themselves know the most certain truth regarding them, but nevertheless, we too must dare to accomplish the labor pains of our questions insofar as divine providence, alongside our own ability, gives us a share in the truth we are looking for. So here is the daring again, combined with the gestation or the labor pains, which we must do. I hope you noticed that in the text, right? We can't do anything else but that, and yet it is bound to fail. Which leads or must lead in Damascius's argument to an epistemological restraint. Just take text 11 as an exemplification of that, taken from commentary on Parmenides in this case. In response to the first question, it doesn't matter what the question was, I forgot. Let us first make this statement, the truest of all. It is the gods themselves who reveal their own divine numbers, and human reasoning could never have the temerity to rebuke anything of the sort, right? So it's not just that we must have the temerity in itself is also a problem, right? It is a problematic stance which always tends to forget our own position as being only human, right? And to trespass the boundaries of our human epistemic abilities. So we have this kind of restraint, this idea that we should be careful about this type of quest and gestation, which echoes Plato's use of sophrosyne in relation to the gods. Remember, you are not the measure, you have to be measured by God. The fallout of this epistemic gap, or this epistemological restraint in Damascius, is otherwise well known. It is actually, in fact, the only, maybe, the most studied at any rate, and maybe the only point that has been studied in recent years about Damascius's philosophy, the aphoretic nature of his thought, the themes of endeixis, the reversal of our accounts, which are only human and revert upon ourselves, and that over against the transcendence and ineffability of the principle. Whenever you read something about Damascius, it's always about that, which makes sense, right? What I want to do now is focus instead not just on the fact of this statement, but also on its consequences, its epistemic and moral consequences. As we saw, Damascius clearly and repetitively links gestation, odys, to tolma, to this overconfidence, this self-conceited belief that we can bridge the epistemic gap after all. So we have to, and yet we can't resist going too far in that. But, says Damascius, we will always remain shackled by our polypragmosyne. So polypragmosyne, which was a term much used in the Greek tradition, maybe just because it applies to this Greek traditional culture very well. So meddling with other people's business, paired with an excess of curiosity, right? That's what it expresses in the first place. It later came to refer to any quest for knowledge in a neutral sense. So polypragmosyne is not just curiosity in terms of gossiping and wanting to know things which are not designed to reach your ears, but also just to get to know anything, right? So in a neutral sense without being derogatory. Damascius actually often uses it in that sense. So his use of the term polypragmosyne does not always have to do with this rejection of vain curiosity. But even in that sense, so in the sense of the quest for knowledge, he also invests it with a pejorative meaning, right? So busying oneself with the multiplicity of affairs you find in the world. Yeah, and then, of course, it's a well-chosen term, polypragmosyne. There are so many pragmata, yeah, and you invest all your interest in finding your way through the multiplicity, and you can expect a Neoplatonist to find this a bit silly, right? So you're actually getting lost in the plurality of lower reality, which is then coupled to this idea, this Platinian idea of tolma, expressing some kind of guilt, right? It's your own choice to do this. That's the daring, right? So the polypragmosyne is not just an expression of an ontological condition, it's also your own attention getting astray, being led astray by this interest in multiplicity. A deliberate option for multiplicity, which has an ontological meaning, obviously, right? And so tolma is then interpreted as the temerity, the daring to divide things. Text number 12. But the parts and the whole, well known to some of us, right? The parts and the whole must be seen in the intermediate state once an abatement occurs, and therefore the parts have come to be in the division they boldly undertake. Yeah? Tolmetenta. So it's also on the part of the things themselves that this multiplication happens, and they have the daring to always multiply further. And so tolma, odys, polypragmosyne, and all the related terms all come down to focusing attention on our ontological state of division, on the multiplicity of our concepts produced by discursive reasoning and jumping from one idea to another. So if we dianoumen, right? If we think discursively, that's what we do. We actually jump from one thing in the multiplicity to another, contenting ourselves with the fact that there is multiplicity and nothing else. So we are, in fact, in doing so, we are focusing on how our logic operates, how our thought orders the world, which makes us blind, actually, to the reality of things in terms of unity. And that's this polypragmosyne, which has this connotation of a guilty conscience because we choose to do so by the human means that are available to us. All right. So what we have been reading is some kind of plea for epistemological restraint. Right? Be careful. If you are investigating the world, you are actually satisfying yourself with the fact that it is multiple, and you will never get beyond that. And the question then is, how far does this epistemological restraint extend? Right? You could imagine somewhere in the world, nowadays more than others, this to be seen as a plea for, I have my own truth, you have yours, and we are past truth, right, in the most positive expression. Or we're just bluntly lying, right? Why am I saying this? So what we have is a failure of our concepts to grasp a unity, contenting ourselves, as I said, with multiplicity. And this failure goes so far that even saying that something is ineffable is actually saying too much, right? Using the word, Damascius says this repeatedly, using the word ineffable is already applying a label to something that cannot be labeled. If you say the first principle is ineffable, actually it's already true. It's like a bottle of wine or water maybe, where you put a label on which you put a label. Well, the label is different from the contents, right? That's the same with the notion of ineffability. If you say, I have X and X is ineffable, you have two things, right? Which is saying too much, and especially on the first principle on which you can say nothing, right? So you could better deny even the fact that it's a principle, and then you have all this apparatic, let's say, self-repeating process, again, as you find it at the beginning of De Principiis of Damascius. Now, the problem is, does this lead to skepticism, right? You could say not just relativism or post-truth or whatever, but it might be the expression of a genuine philosophical stance known as skepticism. There is nothing to be known, and so we withdraw from any positive determination of anything in the world. So nothing whatsoever would do the job of grasping the truth. But it's obvious from the text that that is not what Damascius that's not the point Damascius wants to make. And I think he actually makes the opposite point, right? That the ultimate ineffability of the first principle, which contaminates everything, right? Once you start to say that the first principle of things is ineffable, then this ineffability will be set through in all of its effects. Right? If you don't know what the first principle is, you can't fully explain its first effect. If you can't fully explain the first effect, you can't fully explain the second, and so on and so on. So what is it? It trickles down. Is that into reality, up to a point that Damascius will even say, well, up to the lowest stage or down to the lowest stage, which is matter, you find ineffability. What is Aristotelian matter in the end? It's ineffable, right? Because you don't have any positive determination to make about it. If you do so, you introduce form, and that's already too much. Meaning that in Damascius's view, this ineffability of the first actually imbues everything up to the latest, down to the latest or the lowest stage of reality. So the ultimate ineffability contaminates everything. And it actually means that any affirmation you could make about the first principle will fall short. Yeah? And that could lead a skeptic to say, well, stop making affirmations then, right? So any word, any concept, any language, any grammar will have to be denied eventually, which, by the way, Proclus already ascertained, right? You need negations in order to get to the first principle. But Proclus adds a very important point as a counterpart to that. Those negations, he says, they generate affirmations. By negating something, you actually affirm the fact that this term, this concept, this word is valuable in, let's say, unraveling the highest levels of reality. You're not going to deny that the first principle is a worm, right? It's an unwormy existence. That makes no sense. And why doesn't it make any sense? Because worm is not a term you would use up there. Truth, that's the word you would use. And then you can say it's beyond truth, right? Which any, let's say, any religious tradition would say. I'll come back to that. So you deny the words that lend themselves to be denied, meaning that the denial is not just about anything, it is about a very specific set and a very specific sequence of words, of characteristics, of determinations. Meaning that, for instance, in our present case, the threshold of the good does not come down to a disqualification of the terms truth, proportion, and beauty. Just the contrary, it's the affirmation that those notions make sense up until the threshold of the good, right? So they have their own notional content, which must be taken extremely seriously to then acclaim or to then accept or acknowledge that you go beyond them in determining or non-determining the first principle, right? So this is not skepticism, right? This is actually the building of a solid system, which Damascius in the end does not deny, right? He has criticisms all over the place against Proclus and his predecessors, but he will never deny the standard, fundamental, foundational claims of Neoplatonism, right? Why not? Because that's the framework in which he works. And then you could say, well, we call this that, but that's actually not the right term. We call this that, and that's actually also an inadequate term. But you first need to build up, the riches of your system in order to then be able to put it into perspective, yeah, or to deny its factual contents which is communicated, right? So. Those notions, in a certain sense, help us climb the mountain. Yeah? Not in a Wittgensteinian sense that they are a ladder which you then throw away in the end, but you need them, right? You need this ladder, you need this how did I call it? Those tools that help us climb the mountain in order to get there. Yeah? And not because you need the ladder to come down again. That's maybe not the biggest problem, but because you have nothing else to get there. There is no mysticism in Neoplatonism without rationalism, without rationality, right? You need to make this rational analysis of the world up to its most refined, most sophisticated levels in order to then say, and then yet it's not enough. And there's no other way. So this is a solid reaffirmation of the truth value of the entire system without claiming that the system is, let's say, has a privileged or let's say even an access at all to truth. All right. So let's follow Damascius's footsteps, right? And in the first place, let's ask ourselves, how does the ineffability of the principle cast its shadow on the different attempts to reach it? If restraint is in order, then we know that what we say falls short, right? So if restraint is the basic mentality we need in order to get to know reality, then we already institutionalize, let's say, the idea that we'll never get there fully, right? Eventually, there will be no final answer. So this means that, as we will see, all different philosophical, religious, or epistemic traditions fall short in doing this. All right? There's no privileged position for one vis-a-vis the other. It's actually a coexistence of all those truth claims with their own vocabularies and their own language. If you take text 13, which is the opening phrase of a very long analysis from which we will draw other texts as well, he starts off with a fresh reference to tolma and polypragmosune. Yeah? So text 13. If therefore we should have the daring to give an explanation, aiming not only at a more accurate indication of the nature and analogy of what we are saying, but also at the satisfaction of our truly meddlesome thought, I would say that, and then follows the whole. So he feels the need to start this analysis with, again, recapitulating some kind of or re-expressing this reference to daring and to this gestation and all that comes together with it. And then after this opening fire, Damascius presents a survey of different theological traditions. I'll sum them up. It's extremely boring, but you need to see the multiplicity of it. The Chaldean oracles, the Greek theologies, the Orphic hymns, that is, plus the Greek poets. And then Eastern theologies, the Babylonians, the Magi, the Sidonians, the Phoenicians, and the Egyptians. One is absent, very strange. We are early 6th century AD, right? Very strange, which is a blind spot, but it is there, right? There's no mention made of Christianity, but it would. I'm guessing it would fit the same description. Only it's not taken into account because it's way too low in its aspirations. It's a mass cult, and it will go back. It will go away again, right? Something like, we are the guardians of the true Greek traditions. They have abandoned them, and let's be serious, right? That's actually the mentality of those very late Neoplatonists. Now, by far the longest treatment is reserved to the Chaldean oracles, which had become the standard, let's say, theological text lying behind the Platonic framework in late Neoplatonism. In the course of the exegesis, Damascius formulates a general statement on the relative value of different traditions, which is what interests us now. And so, talking about the validity of applying triadic schemes, that's the problematic at stake, he says the following. Let me quote this passage in full, because we're going to need all of the points mentioned. They therefore, text 14, must no longer be called three, so it's about triadic structures, by adding being three to them, as no otherness is manifest in that realm. And then it comes. Yet, unless we speak in a human language concerning the supra-divine principles, we are otherwise not able to conceive them or to name them, except in such a way that we are compelled to use reason on behalf of the things that are elevated beyond every intellect, life, and being. Indeed, even the gods instruct some of us occasionally concerning these and other realities, though not as they conceive them, nor how they not as they conceive them, nor how they conceive them. No, just as speaking to Egyptians, Syrians, or Greeks, they use these people's particular speech, else it would be fruitless to speak to them. So in their effort to transmit what is theirs to human beings, they will use human language, as is right. Yet this language is composed not only of verbs and nouns as we know them, but also of conceptions that are suitable and adjusted to human beings. If, therefore, we get off the track of that truth as we attempt to chart the intelligible abyss, its depth and nature, and if we are veering toward the lower and divided realities, carried away or dragged down by the inescapability of our own shabby nothingness, is going very far. Neoplatonists, Plato also are always very, let's say, verbose when it comes to denying or, let's say, reprimanding the lower reality and our attachment to it, right? So this shabby nothingness is microprepes udeneia, right? where was I? If therefore we get off the track of that truth as we attempt to chart the intelligible abyss, its depth and nature, and if we are veering toward the lower and divided realities, carried away or dragged down by the inescapability of our own shabby nothingness, we must nevertheless endure this derangement and deviation. There you have it again. We must, right? Otherwise, it is not possible in our present state to have any conception concerning these things. We must be content if we can anyhow grasp it from afar, hardly so and not at all clearly, or if we can obliquely suspect a trace of it that in a way suddenly flashes before our eyes, even if this flash is awakened out of itself somewhere within the soul. It may be small and not very luminous, but nevertheless it becomes a signpost for us, analogous to that superluminous and immense flash over there. But this much we can accept in our discourse, that it castigates itself and agrees that it is not capable of looking at that unified and intelligible light. So, what is Damascius conveying here, right? So, a deep pessimism about the capacity of human thought, human language, and human conception to reach highest reality, and yet we have no other, right? There is nothing else than that to do that. So even if it is a small flash, which comes from wherever, it must be valued for that fact, right? It is a reflection of that intelligible light over there. So let's say four points to be taken from this long passage. First, our account is nothing else than the expression of our pathe, so the way in which we undergo reality, the effects of the principles on us, the way in which we know things produced by the principles, which comes down to this inescapability of our shabby nothingness, right? Which actually is a new expression of this tolma and polypragmosune, right? So a nothingness which has to make sense of the world. Our existence in a divided world should inspire us with restraint or moderation, a la Plato, right? As the insufficiency of our human understanding and language. So the recognition that any of our language is insufficient. Thus indicating, as in Plato, the boundaries of human determinations and definitions of things that exceed our epistemic abilities, right? So our human condition is bound to be some kind of nothingness that tries to unravel things in the world, and we should recognize that this is always going to be, let's say, insufficient in a way. Second, the gods speak to us in ways we understand, right? So it's the gods' initiative, and they adjust to us, not just by speaking a language as we read, Egyptian, Greek, or Syrian, but also by using concepts altogether, right? So they instill us with some kind of knowledge, which is adjusted to the logic of our brain. So they adjust their message to our linguistic, epistemic, or whatever skills. Not just in diverse spoken languages and traditions, but also in the fact that our existence is language bound, right? And any account of reality will have to be or is bound to be linguistic in a certain way. We humans can never get beyond this linguistic conceptualization and expression of things. And we use names, right, which will always remain a tentative, provisory naming of a nameless reality. But we do have language, and if we get some messages from the gods about how the higher realms look like, it is because they change the message in a way that we can understand. Third, and yet we humans have no other access to reality or to truth than via words. So our words are insufficient and we have nothing else. If there were no languages, nothing would be understood at all, right? That would be even worse. So be content with the flashes that we have, but it is the only way in which we can achieve something. Fourth, so the different traditions, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Greeks, and the others, all have their own access way to truth. They all fall short, for sure, meaning that what they say has equal value, right? Egyptians have their own way of expressing the truth, just like Syrians do and the Greeks do, meaning they are all on an equal playing field, right? There is no tradition better than the other. Not that truth doesn't matter any longer, right? It's not relativism. The epistemic expressions will always be embedded in a specific linguistic context. That's what he's saying. So there we are again with this house that has been built, in the Neoplatonist case, the Neoplatonic doctrine, which makes the framework from which they view reality. And that makes sense, right? The conception of truth is reached through the concepts they use there. But the Egyptians, the Babylonians, what was it, the Sidonians and all the other Ians, have their own expression, right? They have their own epistemic tradition from which they can achieve the same position, right? So they are equal, but not the same, right? I'll come back to that. And so Damascius, to conclude this part, disqualifies reason's claim to attain ultimate truth, right? Eventually will never succeed. And at the same time, he affirms the value of reason and language as the only tool or the only possible way of making sense of reality. And that's where it all hinges on this double standard, or this dubitation maybe between we know nothing and we know it all, right? And actually that applies to all traditions. That's the inference Damascius makes here, including the Platonic one, right? So also Plato is just an expression. And actually, if you read Damascius, you will see there are several passages where he actually contradicts Plato. Not saying this explicitly, right? Some people have thought maybe that's because this shrinking circle of maybe 10, 15 people who were still attached to classical Greek polytheistic philosophy, right? Did not want to show any ruptures within their own school. At the same time, the covered criticisms of Plato are there, right? And even he goes so far, text 15, to say that the Parmenides of Plato, and you know how foundational the Parmenides is for Neoplatonic doctrine, that this is nothing but tolma, right? That's very, very harsh, right? So yet our account seeks further the nature of this so-called absolute, I'm sorry, it's not that passage. I haven't taken it up on the handout. Sorry, I should have. Yeah, so the point being, I can give you the reference if you want. The point being that even Plato's, let's say, furthest elaborated theological text is tolma, is an attempt to express something with a daring that we could say something definite about reality, which we can't. All right, excuse me about this confusion. Right, if we then review everything, and that's my final part, what we have is a transcendence of a principle with transcendence of a principle which confronts Damascius with an instance that interrupts his own views, right? He's always reflecting philosophically about something that interrupts this thought and destabilizes and moderates any truth claim, right? So you never know for sure whether what you're saying is true. And much more than in Proclus, you sense this uncertainty, this searching. By the way, De Principiis, we always say it's on the principles. The title is, as far as we have a title, Aporiae kai luces, right? It's apories and solutions about the first principles. which sheds an entirely different light on the supposed contents. Yeah, it's not a treatise on the principles at all. This transcendence of a principle opens a much more broad perspective. It affects the way in which we all are attracted to our innermost truth claims and the fundamental beliefs that motivate our actions. That's let's say, an enlargement I want to make now from what we've been reading in Damascius. The message seems to be prepared to allow any of your metaphysical claims to be interrupted. And you could say, I make no metaphysical claims. That's easier. That's the metaphysical claim, right? So that's a claim about metaphysics. So even that you should be prepared to have interrupted. Meaning, a la Plato in the 4th book of the Laws, be moderate, right? And yet, Damascius upholds definite truth claims, right? His moderation is, as I said, not skepticism, nor relativism, nor is it post-truth. It presents some kind of third way between dogmatic and totally anti-dogmatic claims, a third way that consists in a rather firm attachment to truth claims, right? It makes only sense to have aporia kai luces about the Neoplatonic system if you first accept the Neoplatonic system, right? Without an attachment to truth claims, without setting aside the possibility to be interrupted or the necessity to be moderate in the sense that I have pointed out. That's what I call open metaphysics, right? So a metaphysics that has its own contents and very firm, very solid truth claims, and yet remains open to the fact that it might just be words, right? Open metaphysics, you may know, is a term coined by Husserl and his pupil Patočka, meaning in their definition that in traditional metaphysics, transcendence is always inevitably bound to be ontologized or reified, yeah? Like the Platonic ideas, yeah? You recognize something in the explanation of the world of an intelligible nature, and then you reify the intelligible as something out there. Let's read Patočka because he can say it better than I do. Transcendence is fatally and irreversibly, text 16, converted into a transcendent, supra-worldly reality, a transcendent divinity, all right? And as a counterpart, Patočka himself wanted open metaphysics then to mean an anti-dogmatic stance that does not accept one single truth claim and allows for diverse and manifold answers to metaphysical questions. So instead of saying, I know what the truth is, you recognize the fact that there are no truth claims at all, right? So a metaphysics that tries to make sense of the world without ever achieving a final truth claim. I allow myself to give the term a slightly modified meaning based on the way in which a metaphysical system relates to its own dogmatic principles. And against Patočka, I would argue that open metaphysics, as in the case of Damascius, does have dogmatic truth claims. There is dogmatism within this open metaphysics, a very solid one, as I said, without, for that matter, losing sight of the ultimate uncertainty inherent in the system. Any metaphysical system has its own set of values and beliefs without which even the very idea of transcendence, right? That there is something transcending what you say would be meaningless or void, right? And yet we must be prepared to allow our metaphysics to be interrupted, for instance, by our own notion of transcendence. So the point is a very subtle one. You need solid truth claims in order to disrupt them again. And just saying there are no truth claims disrupts anything and falls into either relativism or skepticism. Right? So you need to acknowledge, that's what Damascius is doing, right? I'm describing, I'm not being normative, right? But what Damascius is doing is finding a way to talk about a truth that is there without saying this is the only way to achieve truth. All right. So an epistemic tradition, as described by Damascius, provides us with the referential framework, the indications, dogmata, as he calls it, the signs, the signposts, as you found them in the text we've been quoting. I think it was text 14. Or the markers underway, right? Or the things on the threshold of the good, all of those things that point in the direction of ultimate reality without eventually doing away with ineffability, right? So that's always going to be there. But we do have solid claims. So Damascius's philosophy reaffirms a strong confidence in the terms and tokens of Neoplatonism. If you think away one good or one being or intelligible realm or the immortality of the soul and so on, if you think that away, you cease being a Neoplatonist. That's not what Damascius is doing, right? So you could say, in the end, it's only words, but you should add, but at least we have words, right? At least we have that. So we have something firm to say about reality, which applies to all concepts we use, right? Without a notion of beauty, goodness, ideas, and intellect, you would cease to be a Platonist. But also the Christians need their Trinity, their concept of Trinity, without which they would cease to be a Christian, right? Like the Jews need their Torah and the Muslims need their revelation to Muhammad, right? If you think that away, if you say, I'm a Christian atheist, yeah, well, you're a Christian first, right? I'm not saying you are Christian in heart, but you need to have a solid, let's say, truth claim against which you can then argue, right? There is no contextless relativism or skepticism, unless just saying there's nothing. So, and yet all of those traditions I mentioned agree, they all agree that words do not suffice to express the ultimate mysteries of revelation or whatever it might be. So this underlies any tradition, and you find expressions of it not in all acts by all religions, by no means, but in the sacred texts of all religions, you would find expressions of this fact, right? Don't assume the place of God. Yeah, don't take yourself to be measure, in the case of Plato, for instance. So this could and will obviously also lead to abandonment of any ultimate truth claim. Right? There are relativists and there are skeptics, and they are in a good right to be so. But even if, and that's what Damascius is stressing, even if you negate things, the negations, as I said, reveal the value of the words you use. That's how an epistemic system shapes the world, right? By building up a system that holds all values, beliefs, truth, and so on together, up to the point where you recognize it's falling short in expressing the final truth, right? That's always going to be the second clause. But the first holds water, right? You know that you have something to say about the world in the tradition in which you are standing. So the markers underway actually are the linguistic pillars of our explanation of the world. And that in an open metaphysics, the absence of ultimate knowledge is not a weakness, but a strength, right? So it is the recognition of the limitations of understanding, as implied in the words we have been using throughout, sophrosune and the rejection of tolma, polypragmosune, and so on. So again, Plato's message in the laws, don't take God's place as a measure. Be moderate, meaning know that maybe the old Socratic dictum, know that you don't know. Know that your knowledge is only human, right? In Damascius's open metaphysics, all epistemic traditions, all of them, except for this non-existent Christianity, apparently, open up transcendent reality. And they equally all fall short of uncovering the ultimate truth about it. So this is not, I've been using many side issues like skepticism, relativism and so on. One more, this is not syncretism a la Greek religion either, right? It's not saying it all comes down to the same. I once was in India visiting a temple for all gods, right? So any religion could there worship their own god because it's all the same, right? Quite the contrary. Damascius takes linguistic expression very seriously. We've been seeing him doing that, right? So he affirms the specificity of every language, acknowledging the fact that without language, there would be nothing to say. And if you use language, it's always going to be in a multiplied way from one tradition to another, right? Actually, the specificity of every language is broadened up to include every epistemic tradition. And from that perspective, it becomes understandable that throughout his questioning, and I should add much to the annoyance of his readers, Damascius often leaves open possible explanations without making a final choice. He lists 4 possible answers to the question at hand, and then he leaves it up to the reader to make up their own mind. And in the same vein, he tends to refer to different traditions without at each time picking one of them as providing the better solution. And I want to conclude by referring to the last text, just to give Damascius the final word, even though quite appropriately, it explicitly refuses to be a final word. 17. Someone could adduce evidence for either hypothesis from the theologies, from the Chaldean and Orphic, he could maintain the second thesis, but from the Egyptian and from the Phoenician, the first. The gods alone would know the truth. But let this point be the end of our deliberation concerning these matters. Perhaps we shall make some investigation again concerning them. Thank you.